Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as the public safety critic for the Conservative Party and the opposition here in the House of Commons, Mr. Speaker, it's my distinct honour to stand and begin our position on this debate on C-22. I'd like to thank the House Leader for her remarks and start off with saying I agree with one part of what she said in response to several questions and comments, in that this is something that probably should have been in place for some time, and if my friend looks back at it, she would know that in the past, in the last generation, this has been examined on several occasions by both Conservatives and Liberals, Mr. Speaker. The MP for Malpeque and her caucus, the former MP from Pictou Antigonish-Guysborough, Peter MacKay from our caucus, was supportive of this concept, as was the retired Senator Hugh Segal, and a number of eminent parliamentarians and scholars have talked about how Canada, as one of the Five Eyes allies, should have some degree of parliamentary oversight of our intelligence and security operations. And so that is a ground of agreement. Now, that's hard to carve when there's a minority parliament and you're trying to do something that needs to be above politics, because the operations and indeed the safety of our security and intelligence personnel depend upon this committee of parliamentarians not being politicized or not being used to advance political ends, Mr. Speaker. And that's why I stand in profound disappointment that the minister did not begin debate on this subject. And you'll see, I want to actually congratulate my friend, the MP from Victoria, the NDP's critic on this subject, and his own extensive background working as a lawyer on national security matters, including as an advisor to the last Conservative government, Mr. Speaker, and including with the Security Intelligence Review Committee, CIRC, some years ago, Mr. Speaker. That member from Victoria and I have collaborated on this subject from the beginning of this Parliament because we want it to be above politics, Mr. Speaker. Sadly, the government has not participated in that collaboration, despite several entreaties to take the politics out of this. So the minister not even appearing to introduce his own bill today on something that is supposed to be above politics is profoundly disappointing. And I'm not overreacting, Mr. Speaker. I've tried to speak to him on this. I wrote the minister on March 1st on behalf of our caucus after consultations, and I said, I quote, "The Conservatives are willing to work with the government on this committee, Mr. Speaker." And I laid out several recommendations that I thought should be part of a parliamentary oversight committee, a special committee of this unique nature, Mr. Speaker. No response. In fact, I collaborated and shared my thoughts and ideas with the NDP critic, the MP from Victoria. I wrote the minister again on April 15th, outlining some additional considerations on how this committee of parliamentarians should work in conjunction with existing bodies like CIRC, and I appreciate the amazing work that CIRC does, and the CSE Commissioner, and this sort of constellation of security oversight and review that we already have. How can this committee fit within that, not to duplicate efforts, not to create a competitive oversight environment? Finally, the minister gave me, what I used to call a thanks for coming out response letter from April 20th, after I wrote him twice, after the member from Victoria from the NDP, the opposition trying to take the politics out of this. And he said, I quote, "It remains the government's intention to engage with parliamentary colleagues as the process of developing the committee of parliamentarians unfolds." That never happened, Mr. Speaker. It never happened despite the opposition asking for this. Let's do this right. Let's do this the way the British, the way the Australians, the way our Kiwi allies do. And the minister has really failed in this department because he has not sat down, he has not taken advice, and in fact he's acted in a very cavalier manner, Mr. Speaker. And you'll see, because this bill violates the privilege of the members of this House, and that could have easily been remedied, Mr. Speaker. Section 6.1 of the bill designates the Prime Minister as the controlling mind of this committee. The Prime Minister, not Parliament, the Prime Minister, who I'll remind you, Mr. Speaker, is just the MP for Papineau. He is a member of this chamber like all of us. He does have a role within the government, Mr. Speaker, but that is separate. And your office, Mr. Speaker, has considered this on several occasions. The Prime Minister should not have full control over this committee. What's ironic is he also designates the members of the upper house, the Senate, which, remember, Mr. Speaker, he tossed the Liberal senators out. The Senate is now independent, according to the Prime Minister. Except with respect to this committee, Mr. Speaker, those members are selected by him as well. And why is this disappointing? Months before C-22, months before. In fact, Mr. Speaker, C-22 was dropped on Parliament about 4 days before we rose for summer. So not only did the minister ignore opposition requests to discuss, it was kind of tossed in before people left. But months before that bill was tabled, and before the structure of this committee was even understood, they appointed a chair to the committee. Mr. Speaker, and I have a lot of respect for my friend from Ottawa South, but that has not left a good impression on how he will take the chairmanship role of this committee, Mr. Speaker. If he wanted to be chair, he should have stood before this place or members of that committee and sought the position of chair, Mr. Speaker. In fact, that was the position his party ran on in the election of last year, Mr. Speaker. It was the Prime Minister's position with respect to committees of parliamentarians. And I'll quote, Mr. Speaker, from their election platform, quote, "To increase accountability, we will strengthen the role of parliamentary committee chairs, including their election by secret ballot," unquote. You know, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister talks so much about sunny ways that the glare of the sun allows him to break a lot of promises, and people don't see them, and they don't get reported. This is yet another broken promise. We're going to make them more accountable. We're going to make them responsible. And if you ever want a committee to be beyond partisanship, it's this one, Mr. Speaker. But sadly, they picked the chair months before they even bring the originating legislation to this House of Commons. That's unparalleled, Mr. Speaker, in terms of contempt for this House. We didn't even know the structure of the committee, yet the deemed chair was traveling around the world with the minister talking about it. What's interesting is the last Parliament, and my friend from, I believe his riding is Saskatoon-Humboldt, or it was in the last Parliament, introduced M431, Mr. Speaker, a motion where the members of this chamber unanimously reaffirmed the desire to have elected chairs of committee, Mr. Speaker. You want to know something ironic about that motion from 2014? The Minister of Public Safety voted for it. So did the MP for Ottawa South, Mr. Speaker. Where was that good intention from that vote? They stood in this place and said, we want committee chairs elected. In fact, that motion from my friend, my Conservative colleague, was to elect the chairs from the entire chamber. Not one person, the MP for Papineau, Mr. Speaker. This is pretty much everything this government does is set up with a facade of sunny ways and accountability and transparency, and it's a mug's game, Mr. Speaker. It's actually not. Everything is done for their own partisan advantage, but it's very much captured in a way that presents them in a positive fashion. The Treasury Board Secretary, the Minister for King's Hands, spoke in favor of the election of chairs, Mr. Speaker. I'll quote, he said, having the election of chairs has the capacity to render committees more independent, potentially more constructive, and less partisan, Mr. Speaker. Another member of their caucus, the member from Coast of Bay's Central Notre Dame in Newfoundland and Labrador, Mr. Speaker, he went further and said that chairs of committees should be elected when he said, however, is it not refreshing that all 308 members of the House have the chance to put themselves in a place where they are the chair of a committee based on their skill of being a member of Parliament and a decent chair? Is it not based? It is not based on what kind of favours are owed to them in a party structure or a reward given for good behaviour. Quite frankly, that is essentially how it works. This takes control away from the executive and brings it back to the House of Commons, Mr. Speaker. That member is still in this caucus. I hope he referenced that in the way C-22 has been handled, Mr. Speaker, where the chair was not elected by this place. The chair was appointed before the committee was even struck. In fact, before the committee even existed. It was just an idea before C-22 was tabled, Mr. Speaker. So it is profoundly disappointing that my friend from Ottawa South has to start under this cloud, because I'm quite sure that, he would have made the case for being the chair. Mr. Speaker, I'll now switch to what renders this legislation essentially ineffective, and why we are standing here still trying to work with the government on it. We want to see some substantive amendments, Mr. Speaker, and I've talked to my NDP colleague on it as well. There are 7 exemptions under Section 14, including that the committee can't look at ongoing investigation that may lead to criminal charges. That's pretty much every investigation or operation of law enforcement or security agencies in the country. Defense intelligence can't be looked at. The Investment Canada Act can't be looked at. And then Section 16, on top of those 7 exceptions, plows on 2 broad, let's catch everything exceptions. Special operational info is excluded, Mr. Speaker, and anything, quote, injurious to national security, Mr. Speaker. So once again, the Prime Minister appoints people, and then he decides, and his ministry decides, and those ministers, Mr. Speaker, are just members of this House like me. They decide what this committee sees, Mr. Speaker. So the exceptions and the outright control at all aspects of this committee by the Prime Minister's office renders it ineffective and does not render it what my friend from Malpak wanted to see years ago, or other parliamentarians wanted to see years ago, Parliament being supreme and actually conducting oversight of security and intelligence, Mr. Speaker. It is a real missed opportunity. I now want to show how the bill, and particularly the ham-fisted way the minister has not worked with the opposition parties on this thing that should be above partisanship, actually violates the privilege of the members of this House. And you know who's going to support me in my argument, Mr. Speaker? The Minister of Public Safety himself, because I'll be using some remarks from him. And the House Leader, tried to discount these exceptions by saying ministers will have to justify why information can't go to this committee. Well, with 20 different doors of exceptions to choose from, it'll be simple to just have this as a token committee that won't be effective. And I think all parliamentarians want this to be effective. It's supposed to be, like it is in the UK, a cabinet-like level of secrecy, with a special room and with special advisors. But if they're not even seeing information relating to an ongoing investigation that may lead to charges, this is essentially window dressing, Mr. Speaker. Why this, I think, violates the privilege of members of this House of Commons, Mr. Speaker, is because your predecessor declared this in Speaker Milliken's reading of April 27, 2010. In that Speaker's ruling, that widely covered Speaker's ruling, the question of privilege was considered with respect to the production of documents regarding Afghan detainees. Now, you remember, Mr. Speaker, the positions were reversed at the time. The Conservative Party was in government. The Minister of Public Safety was then a very upset member of the opposition, as many people were. But the issues and the privilege attaching to the decision of Speaker Milliken is on the mark for this very issue, because it was the balance of what should the House be able to see, what should members of this House be able to see to perform their job, and how do you balance off sensitive information, Mr. Speaker. I will quote Speaker Milliken dealing specifically with this sensitive information argument, that the House Leader said that they'll have to justify why information won't be received. The Speaker said, I quote, "However, I cannot agree with the conclusion that this obviates the government's requirement to provide documents ordered by the House. To accept such a notion would completely undermine the important role of parliamentarians in holding their government to account." He went on, Mr. Speaker, "Before us are issues that question the very foundations upon which our parliamentary system is built. In a system of responsible government, the fundamental right of the House of Commons to hold government to account for its actions is an indisputable privilege and, in fact, an obligation." Now remember, Mr. Speaker, as members of this House, we are the members holding the government to account, Mr. Speaker. And Speaker Milliken was quite clear that the fact that there is sensitive information or intelligence documents or information relating to an ongoing investigation does not remove the obligation of the government to share those documents with this House. That's even more pronounced, Mr. Speaker, now that this government is setting up a specialized committee of parliamentarians with security oversights, with an oath of secrecy. There's even more safeguards for the sensitive information with the committee that wants to be formed by C-22 than that existed over the Afghan detainee issue in 2010. Speaker Milliken went on, Mr. Speaker, to say the right, I quote, "the right of Parliament to obtain every possible information on public questions is undoubted, and the circumstances must be exceptional and the reasons very cogent when it cannot be at once laid before the House." Speaker Milliken was talking before the House, Mr. Speaker. There wasn't even consideration of this highly secret, highly confidential and protected designed committee of parliamentarians. But Speaker Milliken said members of this House, as it stands like this, are entitled to that information, Mr. Speaker. Bill C-22 violates that privilege. The minister could have raised this issue by working with the opposition. We expressed some concerns. He could have raised it with some of the leading experts. He refused to meet with them too, Mr. Speaker. Once again, sunny ways is the slogan, but not the conduct. Finally, I will provide one last quote from Speaker Milliken's judgment because it is germane to this discussion, Mr. Speaker, on why this violates privilege. Quote, "The insinuation that members of Parliament cannot be trusted with the very information that they may well require to act on behalf of Canadians runs contrary to the inherent trust that Canadians have placed in their elected officials and which members require to act in their various parliamentary capacities." Speaker Milliken was clear to say that there can be a balance struck on sensitive information and the absolute right of this House to review information and to hold the government to account, Mr. Speaker. With the apparatus and the security safeguards set up around a special committee of parliamentarians, Mr. Speaker, it's even easier to make sure that balance is struck. And sadly, the minister has missed the mark. Let's see what the minister himself said, Mr. Speaker, some weeks in 2010 after Speaker Milliken's ruling. Then the member for Wascana called the governments of the day holding back some documents. He called it unilateral, arbitrary, and contrary to parliamentary tradition. He then went on to say, I quote, "That series of questions of privilege resulting in your ruling on April 27th, when, in very eloquent terms, you indicated that Parliament did have the right to information. You indicated at the same time that there were sensitivities around issues related to national defence, national security, and international relations, and that the House leaders and parliamentary critics should get together and arrive at a process to make information available to members of Parliament and Canadians for the purpose of holding the government to account, and to do so in a way that would not imperil national security, national defence, or international relations." He went on to say that Parliament was entitled to such information if safeguards could be in place, Mr. Speaker. The minister's own words in 2010 saying that members of this House were entitled to that information, Mr. Speaker. So I would ask this government, through its minister, through its member from Wascana Why the 7 exceptions, Mr. Speaker? Why the 2 blanket exceptions in Section 16 that doesn't allow parliamentarians to fulfill their duties, Mr. Speaker? And why the absolute control by the Prime Minister's office?
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Eglinton Lawrence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable colleague for his comments this morning. He began by recognizing the historical moment that we are at today in the House with the honourable leader introducing for the first time legislation which will create a National Security Committee of Parliamentarians. He then went on to speak very passionately about how we need to raise the bar on openness and transparency and accountability to Canadians. And I wonder, where was that passion over the course of the last 10 years when he, in the last administration, had the opportunity to act in the face of the Air India inquiry and the Arar inquiry and many other commissioned inquiries, which pointed out the need for more transparency and more oversight? Where was that passion? And one last question that I'd like to put to my friend across the way. He cast a number of allegations against the Honourable Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, and he said that, to put it very concisely, that there was no dialogue between the time that he sent the letter to the Minister on this committee and today. I wonder if he might refresh his memory and look back to those occasions when, at the Standing Committee for Public Safety and National Security, he had an opportunity to question the Minister about the structure of this committee, about the membership of this committee, about the leadership of this committee, where the Minister welcomed those comments and the opportunity for any feedback to improve this legislation. I wonder if he might recall those occasions where there was a dialogue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my friend from Eglinton Lawrence. Certainly he knows the importance of such security information, and I'm sure he's been secretly lobbying to have the Prime Minister select him for this committee, and he might bring some good insights to the committee from his work as a Crown Attorney. Mr. Speaker, I highlighted the election promise about the election of chairs because the Prime Minister said that he would act in this way for transparency and accountability reasons. The first opportunity to actually fulfill that promise, he's broken it, Mr. Speaker, on a committee that is of the utmost importance to national safety and security, Mr. Speaker. The Minister who did not introduce this very important bill, when he appeared at committee on estimates, I believe, Mr. Speaker, he had not tabled C-22. He'd appointed the chair, Mr. Speaker. He traveled, the world, I think, to consult, and we know this government enjoys consulting heavily, but there was actually no bill before the committee that I could question the Minister on. As I said, they dropped 3 security or border bills in this Parliament mere days before we rose for summer. Why did they do that, Mr. Speaker? Because they did not want to be held to account, which is what I'm doing today. And I'll remind him, I couldn't finish the quote because I ran out of time. The Minister in 2010, following Milliken's decision, said instead of unilateral absolute control over information, which was the government's original position, the state of play today is that Parliament has taken charge of the process. Let Parliament take charge of the process now, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to salute my colleague and friend, the official opposition critic for public safety and MP for Durham, for his forceful and I thought very lucid presentation this morning. He said a great deal about his efforts to try to get the government to collaborate on what is obviously a very nonpartisan and critical issue, and I share his sense of deep disappointment of the government's unwillingness to work with the opposition on this. He said so much about the failures to provide access to information in this bill, but he also spoke, I thought, very forcefully about the need for the way the chair of this committee is to be elected as an alternative to being appointed by the Prime Minister. And I understand that the British system that the government has talked about being one of the models for this used to allow the Prime Minister to chair the Oversight Committee, but that was abandoned several years ago in favour of an election. Similarly, other Westminster systems like Australia allow that. Indeed, Germany alternates between a government side person and an opposition side person. A private member's bill from the Liberals, the MP for Vancouver Quadra, suggested an elected chair. So through you, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the honourable member whether he believes there's any chance the government might actually get it right and allow that in our bill and accept an amendment to that effect for all the good reasons that he elucidated in his remarks.
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Victoria, and I outlined in my remarks his extensive background and actually national renown for security and legal security issues, and I think he's tried to bring a thoughtful and learned approach to debate. And he was privy to my March 1st letter, where collectively we tried to engage with the minister in this process to make sure that the committee got off to a start that wasn't political. The minister was not interested, Mr. Speaker. And going back to the election of chair, in fact, the credentials of my friend from Victoria are so extensive that he may have wanted to stand for chair of this committee, Mr. Speaker, and would have, according to M431, justified that to the House and Parliament decide itself. My friend from Ottawa South could have done the exact same thing, or with a smaller body of MPs on the actual committee. What's ironic, and I pointed it out, is M431, the motion in the last Parliament about the election of chairs, the minister voted for it. So did the member from Ottawa South, Mr. Speaker. Every time I stand in this House voting on an issue, it's an important decision. And if you believe in that at the time, you should share with Canadians why you no longer believe in it several years later, Mr. Speaker. When it was also in their election platform to make committees and chairs of committees accountable and more effective, the Prime Minister and his minister should also then justify why they're deviating from that promise and their track record of supporting it in the past. I quoted the Secretary of the Treasury Board, the member for Kings Hants, who spoke in favour of Motion 431. I hope he's not silent at the cabinet table, much like he must have been when they are taking Atlantic Supreme Court justice away, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, I listened attentively to what the member was saying, and it reminds me of the road to Damascus. It's almost as if the Conservatives are now saying that we need to have this parliamentary group, because in the past, ever since I've known the Conservatives, they have fought tooth and nail against having a committee established of this nature. One only needs to look at the debates that we had last year surrounding C-51. But I'm glad that they have seen the light and seen the value of doing this. We need to recognize that from the Liberal Party's perspective, we've introduced bills in the past. We can talk about 2004, 2006. We can talk about audits, judicial inquiries. There's been numerous arguments for it. Today, we're taking a very significant step forward in terms of the rights and freedoms of Canadians in every region of our country, Mr. Speaker. And I must say a little bit disappointed that individuals would not recognize just how valuable of a tool this is going to be to protect it. We are a party of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Mr. Speaker. We believe in that. And I'm wondering if the member would at the very least acknowledge that this particular legislation is a part of a platform commitment made by our Prime Minister, and what we are doing is not only is it the right thing to be doing in terms of providing those rights and freedoms and ensuring them, Mr. Speaker, but it is the right thing to be doing also because this is a commitment that our Prime Minister gave to Canadians, which demonstrates that we are listening to what Canadians are saying and we are acting on it. Would the member not agree? And I thank him again for his change in attitude towards this particular committee.
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's certainly no one in this House of Commons that uses their privilege to speak on occasions more than my friend from Winnipeg North, Mr. Speaker. I would note that my colleague and friend from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, is on his heels to speak the most in this House, so he better stand up more often, Mr. Speaker, to keep that title. But I'd refer to him. He spoke about the Charter, which we respect a great deal. He should also respect the privilege of parliamentarians. Since he speaks in this House more than anyone else, he should want to make sure that parliamentarians have unfettered access to hold the government to account, Mr. Speaker. Speaker Milliken, his old colleague, said that that was undisputed right of parliamentarians. His bill is violating that undisputed right, Mr. Speaker. I could have stood on a point of privilege rather than debate, but I want to work with this government. I've tried since March, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, I said this issue is not just Liberal or Conservative, Mr. Speaker. I did mention my friend from Malpeque. Hugh Segal, the senator, had a bill on this, a Conservative senator, Mr. Speaker, so he's wrong to say. In fact, Conservatives support the supremacy of Parliament perhaps far more than the Liberals. And in my preparations for this, I've talked to Ron Atke, Chuck Strahl, distinguished former Conservative parliamentarians who have eminent respect and knowledge on security. It's about time this government listens to them as well.
Resume.